They say that silence has no weight, but I know differently. I've carried it for 43 years, and it has grown heavier with each passing day, pressing against my chest until some mornings I wonder if I'll ever breathe freely again. My name is Margaret Eleanor Whitmore, and this is the story of how I destroyed everything I ever loved, not through malice or cruelty, but through the very silence I thought would protect us all. It began on a Tuesday in October, the kind of crisp autumn day that makes you believe in fresh starts and new beginnings. The maple trees along our street in Burlington, Vermont, had turned that particular shade of gold that photographs never quite capture, the color of hope, I used to think. My daughter Catherine was 7 years old then, with her father's dark curls and my green eyes, and she still believed that her mother could do no wrong. I can still see her that morning, standing at our kitchen window with her small hands pressed against the glass, watching the school bus approach. She was wearing the yellow dress I'd made for her, the one with the sunflowers embroidered along the hem. I'd spent 3 evenings working on those sunflowers, wanting each stitch to be perfect. "Mama," she said, turning to me with that radiant smile that could light up the darkest room, "do you think Mrs. Patterson will like my story about the caterpillar?" I was at the stove, making scrambled eggs the way she liked them, soft, with just a hint of cream cheese mixed in. "I know she will, sweetheart. You're the best storyteller in your class." She giggled, that pure sound of childhood joy that I would give anything to hear again. "You have to say that. You're my mama." "I say it because it's true," I told her, and I meant it. Catherine had inherited something neither Richard nor I possessed, an ability to see magic in the ordinary, to find stories everywhere she looked. Richard came down the stairs then, already dressed in his gray suit, his tie slightly askew the way it always was before I fixed it for him. We'd been married for 9 years, and he still couldn't tie a proper Windsor knot. It was one of those small imperfections that made me love him more, not less. "Morning, Princess," he said to Catherine, kissing the top of her head. Then to me, "Morning, beautiful." I moved to fix his tie, standing close enough to smell his cologne, sandalwood and cedar, the scent I'd bought him for our first anniversary and that he'd worn faithfully ever since. His hands found my waist, and for a moment we were simply husband and wife, bound by love and habit and the comfortable intimacy of years together. "Big day today," he said, his voice pitched low so only I could hear. "The Henderson account. If we land this one, it could mean a promotion." "You'll be brilliant," I assured him, smoothing down his lapels. "You always are." What I didn't say, what I had never said, was how much I worried about the long hours he was working, the stress that was beginning to show in the lines around his eyes, the way he sometimes woke at 3 in the morning and I'd find him at his desk going over numbers and projections. I told myself I was being supportive by not mentioning it, by being the calm harbor he could return to at the end of each grueling day. This was my first silence, though I didn't recognize it as such then. I thought I was being a good wife. Catherine left for school with a hug and a kiss, her little backpack bouncing against her shoulders as she ran to catch the bus. I watched from the doorway, waving until she was out of sight, not knowing that this ordinary Tuesday morning was the last time our family would be whole. Richard left 20 minutes later, distracted, already on his phone with a client. I called out to him to drive safely, but I don't think he heard me. The door closed, and I was alone in our beautiful colonial house with its white picket fence and its garden full of chrysanthemums, surrounded by all the trappings of a perfect life. I should have been happy. By any measure, I had everything a woman could want: a loving husband, a beautiful daughter, a comfortable home in a good neighborhood. We attended the Episcopal Church on Sundays, hosted dinner parties for Richard's colleagues, volunteered at Catherine's school. We were, as our neighbors often told us, the perfect family. But perfection is a prison of its own making, and I had locked myself inside it without even realizing I'd thrown away the key. The phone call came at 2:17 in the afternoon. I remember the exact time because I was watching the kitchen clock, thinking that Catherine would be home in 43 minutes, and wondering if I should bake cookies, or if the store-bought ones I'd picked up that morning would suffice. "Mrs. Whitmore?" The voice was professional, female, carefully neutral. "This is Cheryl from Dr. Morrison's office. We have the results from your husband's tests." My hand tightened on the phone. Richard had mentioned having some routine blood work done a few weeks earlier, something his doctor had recommended during his annual physical. He'd laughed it off, said it was just the doctor being thorough now that he turned 40. "Yes," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Dr. Morrison would like you and your husband to come in tomorrow morning to discuss the results. Would 9 o'clock work for you?" There was something in the careful way she spoke, the studied neutrality of her tone, that sent ice water through my veins. If the tests had been normal, they would have simply called with the results. They wouldn't have asked us to come in. "What's wrong?" I asked, gripping the phone so hard my knuckles turned white. "Please, just tell me." A pause. "I really think it's best if Dr. Morrison discusses this with both of you tomorrow. Can we confirm you for 9 a.m.? I agreed, hanging up with trembling hands. For several minutes, I simply stood in my kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of my life. Catherine's artwork held to the refrigerator with alphabet magnets, the coffee cup Richard had left in the sink that morning, the vase of roses he'd brought me on Sunday just because. Everything looked exactly the same as it had 5 minutes before, but somehow the world had shifted on its axis. I should have called Richard immediately. I should have told him about the appointment, shared my fears, allowed him to comfort me or us to comfort each other. But I didn't. Instead, I cleaned the kitchen, started dinner, and when he came home that evening, exhausted from his presentation to the Henderson account, I smiled and asked him how his day went and said nothing at all about the phone call. This was my second silence, and it was more deliberate than the first. I told myself I was waiting for the appointment the next day, that there was no point in worrying him before we knew anything for certain. But the truth, which I can admit now with the clarity that only devastation can bring, is that I was afraid. I was afraid that speaking the fear aloud would make it real, acknowledging the possibility of something being wrong would somehow manifest it into being. So I stayed silent, and Richard talked about the Henderson account over the pot roast I'd made, describing every detail of his presentation while I pushed food around my plate and tried to ignore the sick feeling in my stomach. Catherine chattered about her day at school, about the gold star she'd received on her caterpillar story, about how Tommy Henderson had pulled her hair at recess, but she told the teacher just like we'd taught her to. We were playing at being a normal family, having a normal dinner, and I was the only one who knew it was a performance. That night, after Catherine was asleep and Richard had retreated to his study to work on some paperwork, I stood at our bedroom window looking out at the street below. The Johnsons across the way had their lights on, and I could see them moving through their kitchen, probably cleaning up after dinner. The Patels next door were sitting on their porch, enjoying the cool evening air. Normal people, living normal lives, unburdened by the weight of secrets and silence. Richard came to bed at midnight, sliding under the covers and pulling me close. "Love you, Maggie," he murmured, already half asleep. "Love you too," I whispered back, the words catching in my throat. I should have told him then. I should have turned in his arms and said, "The doctor called today. They want to see us tomorrow. I'm scared." But I didn't. I lay in the darkness, listening to his breathing slow into sleep, and I carried my fear alone. The next morning, I told Richard about the appointment in the most casual way possible, as if it were nothing more than a routine follow-up. "Oh, by the way," I said as I handed him his coffee, "Dr. Morrison's office called. They want us to come in at 9 to discuss your test results." He looked up from the newspaper he'd been reading. "Both of us?" "That's what they said." I watched the concern flicker across his face, saw him process what this might mean. For a moment, I thought he might ask me when they'd called, why I hadn't mentioned it sooner, but he didn't. He simply nodded, folded his newspaper, and said, "I'll call the office and let them know I'll be late." We drove to Dr. Morrison's office in silence, both of us trapped in our own thoughts. I kept my hands folded in my lap to hide their shaking. Richard stared straight ahead at the road, his jaw set in that particular way it did when he was worried but trying not to show it. Dr. Morrison was a kind man in his early 60s with salt and pepper hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He'd been our family doctor for 6 years, had treated Catherine for ear infections and strep throat, had congratulated us when we told him we were expecting another baby 3 years ago, before I had miscarried at 12 weeks. He knew us and we trusted him, which somehow made what he was about to tell us even worse. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. Once we were seated in his office, he pulled out Richard's file and looked at us with the kind of expression that doctors must practice in medical school, sympathetic but professional, honest but gentle. "Richard, Margaret, I'm afraid I have some concerning news." Richard's blood work showed significantly elevated PSA levels, and the subsequent biopsy confirmed the presence of cancerous cells in the prostate. The words hung in the air between us, each syllable heavy with implications. Cancer. Our perfect life, our careful plans, our beautiful future, all of it threatened by this single word. Richard's hand found mine, gripping it tightly. "How bad?" he asked, his voice remarkably steady. Dr. Morrison leaned back in his chair. "Richard, Margaret, the cancer is aggressive and it appears to have already spread beyond the prostate to the lymph nodes. We're looking at stage 4. Now, that doesn't mean we don't have options." But I'd stopped listening. Stage 4. I knew what that meant. Everyone knows what that means, even if they pretend they don't. Stage 4 meant death. It just meant the timeline was negotiable. "How long?" I heard myself ask, my voice sounding distant and strange to my own ears.
"With aggressive treatment, chemotherapy, radiation, possible surgery, we could be looking at several years. Without treatment," he paused, "perhaps 6 months to a year." Richard's hand tightened on mine painfully. "And with treatment, what are we talking about? Quality of life?" Dr. Morrison was honest, brutally, necessarily honest. The treatment would be grueling. Chemotherapy would make Richard violently ill, would steal his hair and his energy and possibly his dignity. The radiation would cause pain and fatigue. There would be surgeries, each with their own risks and complications. And even with all of that, there were no guarantees. We might buy 2 years, maybe 3 if we were lucky, 5 if we were blessed beyond measure. "I need time to think," Richard said finally, "to discuss this with Margaret, to understand all our options." We left the office with a stack of pamphlets about cancer treatment, support groups, dietary recommendations, and living wills. Living wills. As if any piece of paper could capture the complexity of choosing how to die. In the car, Richard started the engine but didn't drive. He just sat there, staring through the windshield at the parking lot, his hands gripping the steering wheel. "Maggie," he said finally, "I need you to promise me something. Anything. Catherine can never know. Not about how bad this is. She's 7 years old. She needs to believe," his voice cracked, "she needs to believe her daddy is going to be okay." And there it was, the third silence, the one that would prove most devastating of all. He was asking me to lie to our daughter, to protect her from the truth, to wrap her in a cocoon of false hope. Every instinct I had as a mother screamed against it, but I looked at my husband's face, saw the fear and love and desperate need there, and I nodded. "I promise," I said. I didn't know then that this promise would become a prison, that it would force me to smile while my heart was breaking, to pretend everything was fine while my world crumbled around me. I didn't know that protecting Catherine from the truth would ultimately be the thing that destroyed her. Richard decided to undergo treatment. It was a decision we made together, lying in bed late one night, about a week after the diagnosis, speaking in whispers even though Catherine was asleep down the hall. "I want to fight," he said, "even if the odds are terrible, even if it means being sick for however much time I have left. I want to try. For you. For Catherine." So we fought. God, how we fought. The chemotherapy started 3 weeks later. I'll spare you the details of those sessions, the hours spent in the sterile oncology ward, surrounded by others waging the same desperate battle. I'll spare you the description of holding Richard's hand while poison dripped into his veins, of driving him home afterward and helping him to bed, of cleaning up when the nausea became too much for him to control. But I can't spare you, can't spare myself, from remembering Catherine's face during those months. "Why is Daddy so tired all the time?" she asked me one Saturday afternoon. Richard had fallen asleep on the couch at 2 in the afternoon, too exhausted from his treatment to take her to the park as he'd promised. "He's just been working very hard, sweetheart," I told her, the lie sliding easily from my lips. "He needs extra rest." "But he promised we'd feed the ducks today." "We'll go tomorrow," I said, knowing that tomorrow he might not feel any better, that the promises were becoming harder and harder to keep. She looked at me with those green eyes that mirrored my own, and I saw something flicker there. Doubt, perhaps, or the first stirring of mistrust. Children are more perceptive than we give them credit for. They know when the adults around them are hiding something. "Is Daddy sick?" she asked quietly. My heart stopped. This was the moment. I could tell her the truth, could bring her into our circle of fear and hope and desperate courage. I could prepare her, gently and age-appropriately, for what might be coming. But I'd made a promise to Richard, and more than that, I looked at her little face, still so innocent, still so full of faith in the world's basic goodness, and I couldn't bear to shatter it.
Daddy has been a little under the weather," I said carefully, "but he's getting treatment, and the doctors are taking very good care of him. You don't need to worry, sweet girl." She seemed to accept this, going back to her coloring book. But I noticed that she drew a picture that day of our family, her and me holding hands, and Richard far off to the side, alone. When I asked her about it, she just shrugged. "That's just where Daddy is now," she said. The autumn turned to winter, and Richard's hair fell out in clumps. He started wearing a beanie inside the house, making jokes about starting a new fashion trend. Catherine laughed at his jokes, but I saw how she stared at him when she thought no one was looking, trying to reconcile this tired, thin stranger with the father who used to toss her in the air and chase her around the backyard. Christmas that year was both beautiful and heartbreaking. Richard was between chemo cycles, feeling well enough to participate in our traditions. We cut down a tree together, a smaller one than usual, because Richard couldn't manage anything too heavy, and decorated it with Catherine while drinking hot chocolate and listening to carols. "This is perfect," Richard said, standing back to admire our work. Catherine was adjusting an ornament on a low branch, completely absorbed in getting it positioned just right. He looked at me over her head, and I saw everything he wasn't saying. This might be our last Christmas together. This might be the last time the three of us do this. Remember this. Hold on to this. I smiled back at him, blinking away tears, and said nothing at all. On Christmas morning, Catherine opened her presents with the unrestrained joy of childhood. Richard and I had gone overboard, buying her more than we normally would, unable to resist the urge to give her everything we could while we still could. She got the bike she'd been wanting, books, art supplies, a dollhouse we'd spent 3 evenings assembling after she'd gone to bed. "This is the best Christmas ever," she exclaimed, throwing her arms around both of us. Richard held her close, his eyes closed, his thin arms trembling slightly. "I love you, Princess," he whispered. "Don't ever forget that." "I love you too, Daddy," she said, squirming away to examine her new bike. "Can we go riding later?" "Maybe tomorrow," I interjected quickly, seeing the exhaustion on Richard's face. "Let's let Daddy rest today." She pouted but didn't argue. She was getting used to Daddy needing rest, to plans being postponed, to the careful dance we all did around his illness, without ever naming it aloud. That night, after Catherine was asleep, Richard and I sat by the Christmas tree, the colored lights casting soft shadows across the room. "I made it to Christmas," he said. "The doctors weren't sure I wouldn't." "Don't," I said, my voice breaking. "Don't talk like that. Maggie, we need to talk about what happens when—" "No," I stood up abruptly. "No, we don't. You're doing well. The treatment is working. We have time, but we didn't have time. That's the cruel joke of it all. We never had time." Richard was back in the hospital by New Year's Eve, his immune system compromised by the chemo, fighting off pneumonia. I spent the countdown to midnight in his hospital room, holding his hand while he slept feebly, listening to fireworks in the distance, marking the arrival of a year he might not see the end of. My mother had come to stay with us, to help with Catherine while I spent hours at the hospital. She knew the truth. I'd had to tell her, had needed someone to share the burden with, but she followed my lead in maintaining the fiction around Catherine. "Your father is just a little sick," she asked when Catherine asked. "He'll be home soon." More lies, more silence, layer upon layer of it, building a wall between Catherine and reality. Richard came home from the hospital in mid-January, weaker than before. He'd lost so much weight that his clothes hung on him like they belonged to someone else. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor that no amount of sunshine or fresh air seemed to remedy. Catherine was frightened of him now, though she tried to hide it. I'd catch her staring at him with wide eyes, staying just out of reach when he tried to hug her. It broke his heart. I could see it in his face every time she flinched away or made an excuse to leave the room when he entered. "She's scared of me," he said to me one night, tears streaming down his face. "She just needs time to adjust," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. "She doesn't understand what's happening." "Then tell her," he said with sudden urgency, gripping my hand. "Explain it to her. Help her understand." "You asked me not to," I reminded him. "You said she couldn't know how bad it was." "I was wrong." His voice was desperate now. "I can see it in her eyes, Maggie. She thinks I don't love her anymore, that I'm pulling away from her. She doesn't understand that I'm trying to memorize every detail of her face, that every moment with her is precious, because I don't know how many more I'll have. So we'll tell her," I said, relief flooding through me. "Tomorrow, we'll sit her down and explain, gently, that you're very sick, but that you love her more more than anything. But when tomorrow came, Richard changed his mind. He saw Catherine at breakfast, laughing at something on the television, her face bright and carefree, and he couldn't do it. "Not yet," he whispered to me. "Just a little longer. Let her be happy just a little longer." So the silence continued, growing heavier, more oppressive. I was caught between my husband's wishes and my daughter's needs, between protecting and preparing, between truth and kindness. I chose silence, and in doing so, I chose wrong. February brought a brief reprieve. Richard responded well to a new treatment protocol, regaining some energy, some color in his cheeks. For a few precious weeks, we almost felt normal again. He was able to take Catherine to school some mornings, to sit with her when she did homework, to read her bedtime stories. "See," he said to me, "we have time. We'll tell her when the time is right." But in our hearts, we both knew we were running out of tomorrows. March came in like a lion, and with it the return of Richard's symptoms with a vengeance. The pain was worse now, requiring stronger medications that left him foggy and confused. He started having trouble remembering things. Small things at first, like where he'd put his reading classes or what day of the week it was. Then bigger things, like appointments or conversations we'd had the day before. Catherine noticed. Of course she noticed. "Mommy, why did Daddy ask me the same question 3 times?"
She studied my face for a long moment, and I saw something shift in her expression, a hardening, a closing off. She didn't believe me anymore, I realized. At some point, without my noticing, my 7-year-old daughter had stopped trusting my words. "Okay, Mommy," she said, but her voice was flat, emotionless. From that day forward, she stopped asking questions about Richard's condition. She became quiet, withdrawn, spending hours in her room drawing pictures she wouldn't show me. When I tried to talk to her about how she was feeling, she'd just shrug and say she was fine. She'd learned silence from me, I realized with horror. I'd taught my daughter that the way to cope with fear and pain was to lock it away inside, to present a brave face to the world, to never speak the terrifying truths that kept you awake at night. April brought daffodils and cherry blossoms and Richard's decision to stop treatment. "It's not working anymore," he told me, and I could hear the defeat in his voice. "The cancer is spreading. The treatments are just making me sick without buying us any meaningful time." "But there are other options," I argued desperately. "We could try—" "No, Maggie, I'm done fighting. I want to spend whatever time I have left actually living, not throwing up in a hospital bathroom." "How long?" I asked, the question I'd been avoiding for months. "Dr. Morrison thinks maybe 6 weeks. 2 months at the outside." 6 weeks. 8 at most. And Catherine still didn't know. "We have to tell her now," I said. "We can't wait any longer." Richard nodded, tears streaming down his face. "Together. We'll tell her together." We planned to do it that Saturday. We'd take her to the park, her favorite place, and we'd explain, as gently as possible, that Daddy was very sick and that he might not get better. We'd tell her that it wasn't her fault, that we loved her, that we'd get through this together. But Friday night, Catherine came down with a fever. Nothing serious, just a cold. But she was miserable and cranky, and Richard didn't want to deliver devastating news when she was already feeling terrible. "Next week," he said, "when she's feeling better." Next week came, and Richard was the one who wasn't feeling well, bedridden with pain that even the strongest medications couldn't quite touch. The week after that, my mother fell and broke her hip, and I had to juggle caring for Richard, supporting my mother, and keeping everything normal for Catherine. There was always a reason to wait, always something that made it not quite the right time, and with each passing day, the truth grew larger and more terrible until telling it seemed impossible. Richard declined rapidly in May. The cancer had spread to his bones, his liver, his lungs. He was on hospice care now, with nurses coming to the house daily. We'd converted the downstairs study into a bedroom for him because he can no longer manage the stairs. Catherine knew something was very wrong now. It was impossible to hide, but we still hadn't used the words.
We hadn't said dying or death or goodbye. One afternoon in mid-May, I found her sitting on the stairs, watching through the banister rails as the hospice nurse tended to Richard. Her small face was pale, her eyes huge and frightened. "Mama," she whispered when she saw me, "is Daddy going to die?" This was it. This was the moment where I could finally tell her the truth, where I could bring her into the circle of grief and love and help her understand what was happening. But Richard was right there, just in the next room, and I could hear him talking to the nurse, his voice weak but trying to stay cheerful. I thought about my promise to him, about his wish to protect Catherine from the worst of it. "Come here, baby," I said, sitting down on the stairs and pulling her into my lap. She came willingly, burying her face in my shoulder. "Daddy is very sick," I said carefully. "The doctors are doing everything they can, but sometimes people don't get better no matter how hard we try. But he's not going to die, right?" Her voice was muffled against my shirt. "He can't die." I should have said yes. I should have said, "Yes, sweetheart, Daddy is dying, and it's going to be very soon, and it's going to be terrible, and we're going to miss him forever." I should have given her the truth, however painful, and helped her begin to process it. Instead, I said, "We have to take it one day at a time and hope for the best." She pulled back to look at me, and I'll never forget the expression on her face. Confused, hurt, angry. "You're lying," she said, and it was an accusation. "You're always lying. You treat me like a baby, but I'm not stupid. I know Daddy is dying." "Catherine, I hate you," she screamed, pushing away from me and running up the stairs. "I hate you for lying to me." Her bedroom door slammed, and I sat on the stairs, shaking, while my world crumbled around me. From the study, I could hear Richard calling weakly for me, and from upstairs, I could hear Catherine sobbing. I'd failed them both. In trying to protect everyone, I'd protected no one. That night, after Catherine had cried herself to sleep and Richard had been settled by the night nurse, I sat alone in our kitchen, the same kitchen where this story had begun 7 months earlier. The sunflower dress I'd made for Catherine was in the laundry basket, grass-stained from school, and I held it against my chest and cried for everything we'd lost, everything I'd ruined with my silence. I went up to Catherine's room and sat beside her bed, watching her sleep. Her face was blotchy from crying, her breathing still hitching occasionally with leftover sobs. I smoothed her hair back from her forehead, the way I'd done since she was a baby. "I'm so sorry," I whispered. "I thought I was protecting you, but I was just protecting myself. I was too afraid to face the truth, so I made you face it alone." She didn't wake up, and maybe that was better. What could I have said that would have made it right? Richard died 3 days later, on a Tuesday morning in late May. The sun was shining, the birds were singing, and the world kept turning as if something devastating hadn't just occurred. Catherine had been at school when it happened. I'd sent her, thinking we had more time, thinking I could call her home if Richard took a turn for the worse. But death doesn't wait for convenient moments. He went peacefully, the hospice nurse assured me, slipping away between one breath and the next. I had to pick Catherine up from school and tell her that her father was gone. I'll never forget walking into her classroom, seeing her look up from her math worksheet with hope and fear roaring in her eyes. She knew immediately. Maybe she saw it in my face, or maybe she'd known all along that this day was coming. She stood up from her desk, gathered her things with quiet dignity, and took my hand. We walked out of the school together in silence. In the car, she finally spoke. "He's gone, isn't he?" "Yes, baby. I'm so sorry." This morning, very peacefully. He didn't suffer at the end. She nodded once, staring straight ahead through the windshield. "Did he ask for me?" The question broke my heart. "He'd been unconscious since last night, sweetheart. But I know if he could have, he would have wanted you there. He loved you so much." "I didn't get to say goodbye," she said, her voice small and lost. And there it was, the terrible, unavoidable truth. In trying to protect her from pain, I'd stolen her chance to say goodbye to her father, to tell him he loved him one last time, to hold his hand as he left this world. "I know," I said, tears streaming down my face. "I know, and I'm so sorry. I made a terrible mistake. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I was wrong." She didn't cry. She just sat there, dry-eyed and still, radiating a kind of grief that was too deep for tears. The funeral was on a Saturday. Catherine wore a black dress I'd bought for the occasion, her dark hair pulled back in a neat ponytail. She looked like a tiny adult, solemn and composed, greeting the mourners with polite thank yous for their condolences. I watched her with a mixture of pride and horror. She was being so brave, so strong, but she was 8 years old. She shouldn't have had to be strong. She should have been allowed to fall apart, to scream and cry and rage against the unfairness of it all. But I'd taught her silence, and she'd learned the lesson well. After the funeral, back at our house, filled with well-meaning neighbors and friends bearing casseroles and condolences, I found Catherine sitting in Richard's study, the room that had been his bedroom for those last weeks. She was in his desk chair, spinning slowly, her feet not quite touching the ground. "Hey, sweet girl," I said softly. "Are you okay?" She stopped spinning and looked at me with eyes that seemed far too old for her face. "I found something," she said, holding up a notebook. I recognized it immediately. Richard's journal, the one he'd started keeping after his diagnosis. He'd written in it nearly every day, documenting his thoughts, his fears, his hopes. "That was Daddy's private," I started to say, but she cut me off. "He wrote about me," she said. "He wrote about how much he loved me, about all the things he wanted to tell me but couldn't, about how sorry he was that he was leaving me." Her voice finally cracked. "Why couldn't he just tell me? Why did he have to write it in a book instead of saying it to my face?" I knelt down in front of her, taking her small hands in mine. "Because he was scared, baby, just like I was scared. We thought we were protecting you, but really we were protecting ourselves from having to face how terrible this all was." "I could have handled it," she said, and she sounded so sure, so mature. "If you just told me the truth from the beginning, I could have handled it. But you lied, and now he's gone, and I didn't get to say goodbye, and I didn't get to tell him that I wasn't scared of him, that I still loved him even when he looked different, even when he was sick. Oh, sweetheart, he knew." "No," she said firmly, "he didn't know, because I was too scared to tell him, because you taught me to pretend everything was fine when it wasn't, and now it's too late." She was right. God help me, she was absolutely...
And her writing? She pulled out a composition notebook and opened it to a page filled with Catherine's careful handwriting. "We've been doing exercises in creative writing," Mrs. Patterson explained. "I asked the children to write about a happy memory. This is what Catherine wrote." I read the words my daughter had written. "I used to be happy, but I don't remember how it feels. My daddy died and my mama lied. She said he would be okay, but he wasn't. She said I didn't need to worry, but I should have worried. She said everything would be fine, but nothing will ever be fine again. I don't trust grown-ups anymore because they say one thing but mean another. The truth is scary, but lies are worse." I could barely see the words through my tears. "What do I do?" I asked Mrs. Patterson. "How do I fix this?" "I think Catherine needs professional help to process her grief," she said carefully, "and perhaps family counseling for both of you. The lying she mentions, can you tell me about that?" So I explained it all. The diagnosis, the decision to hide the severity from Catherine, the months of half-truths and false hope, the way Richard and I had convinced ourselves we were protecting her when really we were just too afraid to face the truth ourselves. Mrs. Patterson listened without judgment, and when I finished, she simply said, "Children are more resilient than we give them credit for, but they need honesty. They need to trust that the adults in their lives will tell them the truth, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." "I know that now," I said, "but I can't take it back. I can't give her those months back. Can't give her the chance to say goodbye to her father." "No," Mrs. Patterson agreed. "You can't. But you can commit to being honest with her from now on. You can apologize, really, truly apologize, and then you can show her through your actions that she can trust you again." I started taking Catherine to a child psychologist the following week. Dr. Sarah Chen specialized in childhood grief, and she was exactly what Catherine needed: patient, understanding, and unflinchingly honest. In our first family session, with Catherine sitting between us, Dr. Chen looked at me and said, "Margaret, I think you need to tell Catherine why you and her father decided not to tell her about the severity of his illness." So I did. I looked at my daughter, and I gave her the truth, raw and unvarnished. "I was terrified," I said. "When we found out how sick Daddy was, I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could imagine was a world without him in it, and it was so horrible that I wanted to pretend it wasn't happening.
And when Daddy asked me not to tell you how bad things were, I agreed because it was easier than facing the truth. But that was wrong. It was selfish, and it was wrong. You deserved to know. You deserved the chance to spend time with your daddy knowing that time was limited. You deserved the chance to say goodbye, to tell him you loved him, to ask him questions and make memories knowing they might be your last. I stole that from you because I was a coward, because I thought protecting you from pain was more important than preparing you for it. And I am so, so sorry. Catherine listened to all of this with that same solemn expression she'd worn since Richard's death. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I'm angry at you." "I know," I said. "You have every right to be." "I'm angry at Daddy too," she continued, "for asking you to lie, for not being brave enough to tell me himself." "That's okay," Dr. Chen interjected gently. "It's okay to be angry at people you love. Anger is part of grief." "I don't know if I can forgive you," Catherine said to me, her voice small but steady. "I understand," I said, my heart breaking. "I hope someday you can, but I understand if you can't. What I did was unforgivable." "Dr. Chen," Catherine said, turning to the psychologist, "will you help me figure out how to not be so angry all the time? Because it makes my stomach hurt and I can't sleep and I just want to feel okay again." "Yes," Dr. Chen said. "That's exactly what we're going to do." The work was slow and painful. Therapy sessions where Catherine raged and cried and finally began to grieve openly. Family sessions where we learned to communicate honestly, where I learned to sit with uncomfortable truths instead of hiding from them. I learned that my silence hadn't just hurt Catherine, it had robbed her of agency, of the ability to make her own choices about how to spend time with her father in his final months. If she'd known he was dying, she might have chosen to skip soccer practice to sit with him. She might have asked him questions about his life, recorded his voice, gathered memories to hold on to. Instead, she'd been kept in the dark, and those opportunities were lost forever. The guilt of this merely destroyed me. There were nights when I couldn't sleep, when I'd replay those months over and over, imagining how things could have been different if only I'd been braver, more honest, less afraid. Dr. Chen helped me understand that my guilt, while justified, wasn't productive unless I learned from it. "You can't change the past," she told me, "but you can change how you move forward. You can commit to radical honesty with Catherine from now on. You can show her that people can make terrible mistakes and still deserve forgiveness, still be worthy of love." Catherine's 8th birthday came in July, 2 months after Richard's death. She said she didn't want to party, didn't want to celebrate. I almost accepted this, almost let her skip the day entirely because I was still so afraid of pushing her, of making another wrong choice. But then I remembered Dr. Chen's words about honesty, and I realized that letting her skip her birthday entirely would be another form of silence, another way of avoiding difficult emotions. So I sat down with her and I said, "I know you don't feel like celebrating. I don't either. But I think Daddy would have wanted us to mark the day somehow, even if we're sad. What if we did something small, just the two of us? We could go to your favorite restaurant, or go see a movie, or just get ice cream and go to the park. Whatever you want." She thought about it for a long time. Then she said, "Can we go to the lake, the one where we went last summer with Daddy?" It was the first time she'd suggested doing anything related to Richard, the first time she'd wanted to actively remember instead of avoiding the memories. "Of course we can," I said. So on her 8th birthday, Catherine and I drove to Lake Champlain. We brought a picnic lunch and sat on the same beach where we'd spent a day the previous summer, when Richard was still healthy, when we were still a complete family. Catherine was quiet for a long time, watching the waves lap against the shore. Then she said, "Tell me about that day, last summer. I remember parts of it, but I want to hear your version." So I told her. I told her about how Richard had insisted on bringing an enormous umbrella that kept blowing away in the wind, how she'd convinced him to build an elaborate sandcastle with her, complete with a moat and towers, and how he'd worked on it for hours, sunburned and happy, how he'd carried her into the water on his shoulders, spinning around until they were both dizzy and laughing. "He was so happy that day," I said. "You made him so happy." "I wish I'd known," Catherine said. "I wish I'd known to pay more attention, to remember harder." "You couldn't have known," I said. "That's not your fault, that's mine." She leaned against me, and I put my arm around her, and we sat like that for a long time, just watching the water and remembering. "Mom," she said finally. She'd started calling me Mom instead of Mama recently, another mark of how much she'd grown up too fast. "Yes, sweetheart. Do you promise to always tell me the truth from now on, even when it's scary or sad?" "I promise," I said. "No more lies, no more silence, even when it's hard." "Okay," she said. Then so quietly I almost didn't hear it. "I think maybe someday I can forgive you. Not yet, but someday." It was the most hope I'd felt in months. The next few years were hard. Catherine struggled in school, had nightmares, acted out in ways she never had before. I struggled too, with grief and guilt, and the overwhelming responsibility of single parenthood. My mother helped when she could, but she was dealing with her own health issues, and ultimately it left us Catherine and me, figuring out how to survive in a world without Richard. But we kept going to therapy. We kept talking, honestly and openly, about our feelings. When Catherine was angry at me, she said so. When I was overwhelmed, I admitted it instead of pretending everything was fine. We learned to cry together, to acknowledge the hard days instead of forcing fake smiles. Slowly, painfully, we began to heal. Catherine's relationship with trust remained complicated. She was skeptical of adults, quick to question authority, always watching for signs that someone was lying to her. But Dr. Chen helped her see this as a strength rather than a weakness. She'd learned young that even people who love you can make terrible mistakes, and that awareness would serve her well in life. When Catherine was 11, she started writing stories again. They were dark, these stories, full of loss and betrayal and complicated emotions. But they were also honest and powerful and beautiful. She showed them to me hesitantly, as if expecting me to tell her they were too sad, too heavy for a child to be writing. Instead, I read them carefully and said, "These are incredible. You have a real gift for expressing difficult truths." She looked surprised. "Really? You're not going to say they're too depressing?" "No," I said. "I think writing about pain is how we process it. I think your father would be so proud of how you're using your words to make sense of what happened to us." Something shifted in her eyes then, a softening, a tiny crack in the wall she built between us. When Catherine was 13, we had what she later called the big conversation. She'd been learning about cancer in her science class, and she came home with questions I'd been dreading but knew I needed to answer. "Mom," she said, "did Daddy suffer at the end?" I could have lied. I could have given her a sanitized version of Richard's death, spared her the details of his pain, his fear, his final difficult hours. But I'd promised her the truth, and I meant to keep that promise. "Yes," I said, "he suffered. The pain was very bad sometimes, even with all the medication. He was scared. He didn't want to leave us. Those last few days were very hard for him." She absorbed this, her face pale but said, "I'm glad you told me. I needed to know." "Why?" I asked gently. "Because everyone always says death is peaceful, like people just slip away. But that's another lie, isn't it? Sometimes death is hard and scary and unfair."
And if we can't be honest about that, then what's the point? My daughter, at 13, had learned the lesson I'd taken 40 years to understand, that truth, however painful, is always better than comfortable lies. Catherine is 24 now, graduating with honors from college with a degree in journalism. She chose that field deliberately, she told me, because she wants to uncover truths, to tell stories that matter, to give voice to people who have been silenced. She still has nightmares sometimes. She still has trouble trusting people fully. The wound of those months when I lied to her hasn't fully healed, and I don't know if it ever will. But we talk. We're honest with each other. When she's angry at me, and she still gets angry sometimes, when something reminds her of that terrible time, she tells me, and I listen, and I apologize again, and I remind her that I'm still learning how to be better. Last week, she called me from her apartment in Boston. She'd been offered a job at a major newspaper, covering healthcare and end-of-life issues. "I think I want to take it," she said. "I think I want to write about the things that scared us so much we couldn't speak about them, about how we treat dying patients, about how we talk to children about death, about the lies we tell ourselves to make hard things easier." "That sounds perfect for you," I said, my heart full. "Mom," she said, "I've been thinking a lot about what happened with Dad, about the choices you made, the mistakes." My chest tightened. "Okay." "I forgive you," she said simply. "I've been holding on to it for so long, being angry at you, at him, at the whole situation. But I'm ready to let it go now. I know you were doing the best you could. I know you thought you were protecting me." I started crying, ugly, grateful sobs that I couldn't control. "Thank you," I managed to say. "You don't know what that means to me." "I think I do," she said, "because I've been carrying it too, all this time, and it's heavy, you know? The anger, the resentment, I'm tired of carrying it." We talked for over an hour that night, really talked, about Richard and grief and forgiveness and the complicated nature of love. At the end of the call, Catherine said something that will stay with me for the rest of my life. "Mom, I'm writing a piece about children and grief for my portfolio. Would you be willing to be interviewed? To talk honestly about what we went through, about the mistakes that were made, about what you'd do differently?" "Yes," I said without hesitation.
If it can help even one family avoid the mistakes I made, I'd be honored. So here I am, telling this story, owning my failures, acknowledging the damage my silence caused, but also honoring the hard work of healing that Catherine and I have done together. I destroyed my family through silence. I let fear dictate my choices, and in trying to protect my daughter from pain, I inflicted a different, deeper wound. I can't take that back. I can't give Catherine those lost months with her father. I can't erase the betrayal she felt when she realized I'd been lying to her. But I can tell the truth now. I can stand up and say, I was wrong. I made terrible choices. And if you are facing something similar, if you have a sick loved one and children who need to understand what's happening, please, please don't make the same mistakes I did. Children deserve the truth. They deserve to be trusted with hard things. They deserve the chance to say goodbye, to ask questions, to grieve in their own way and on their own timeline. Yes, the truth is painful. Yes, it's hard to look into your child's eyes and tell them something that will break their heart. But lies are worse. Silence is worse. The betrayal of being kept in the dark about something so fundamental is worse. I know this because I lived it. Because I watched my bright, happy 7-year-old daughter transform into a guarded, mistrustful child who no longer believed the adults around her would tell her the truth. Because I saw the damage firsthand, and I spent 16 years trying to repair it. Catherine and I are okay now. We're better than okay. We have a relationship built on honesty and hard-won trust. But we had to fight for that, had to wade through years of anger and hurt and difficult conversations to get here. I often think about that Tuesday in October when this all began, about the yellow dress with the sunflowers, about Catherine's smile, about Richard's slightly crooked tie, about how ordinary that morning was, how full of promise and possibility. I can't go back to that morning. I can't make different choices. All I can do is live with the consequences and try to help others avoid the same mistakes. If I could speak to my younger self, to that woman standing in her kitchen making scrambled eggs while her world was about to fall apart, I would tell her this. Be brave. Tell the truth, even when it hurts. Trust your daughter with hard things. Give her the chance to say goodbye. Don't let fear dictate your choices. Don't trade short-term comfort for long-term damage. And most importantly, silence is not protection. Silence is not kindness. Silence is just fear dressed up as love. The weight of silence has been my burden for 43 years. I carried it alone at first. Then I made my daughter carry it too. It took us both years to learn how to set it down, how to speak the truths we'd hidden, how to breathe freely again. If you take anything from my story, let it be this. Tell the truth. Trust your children with reality. Give them the gift of honest grief, rather than the burden of comfortable lies. Because in the end, the only thing heavier than the weight of painful truth is the weight of silence. And that weight, I can tell you from experience, is unbearable.